Hi everyone! So before we get into this dumpster fire of a video, I wanted to briefly plug my Patreon account. Yes, I decided to make a Patreon because for one, my unemployment benefits are running out, and two, I get paid like 50 cents a day from AdSense, so if you appreciate my content and you want to support me, consider becoming a patron. This video was very labor intensive, so if you want to leave a one-time tip, I've also linked my Venmo. Alright, let's cringe together.
I do think that anti-capitalist sentiment is inherently anti-vegan. A couple months ago, I did a Q&A, and one of the questions was about my political ideology, and I was asked if I considered myself neoliberal, and I said, yeah, I would consider myself neoliberal. And then I kind of gave a little bit more detail, expanded on that a bit in a follow-up Q&A, because the comments on the first one, people were kind of mad at me. It ranged from people confusing neoliberalism and libertarianism, they're not the same thing, to kind of like you're dead to me type comments for not opposing capitalism, even equating it to fascism, even saying that it was inconsistent with veganism. So I wanted to address it, the kind of extreme anti-capitalist sentiment and how that relates to veganism. Shouldn't be controversial. For those who don't know, neoliberal is like your typical left-leaning social progressive, but also being generally pro-free market with few restrictions on a lot of industries like housing, but also very pro-welfare state, as libertarians would say. Neoliberals want a substantial safety net, often even supporting public options like healthcare, for instance. Not all neoliberals do. Of course, there's going to be disagreement when the private options aren't serving the public.
As countless people have pointed out in the comments, her definition of neoliberal does not match the commonly understood definition. It's important to note that language evolves over time. The origin of the term seems to align with her view, modern economic policy with state intervention. This ideology stood in opposition to laissez-faire classical liberalism. But how it is defined today differs from how it was defined in the past. Attempting to restore its original meaning, as Swayze is doing, is futile. It would be like a Republican insisting on reclaiming the label Democrat, because the parties switched platforms and the Democratic Party used to be the Conservative Party. Don't ask me why. Today, neoliberalism is characterized by the embrace of free market capitalism, deregulation, free trade, privatization, and austerity, aka cuts to social spending. Although it is commonly associated with the economic policies introduced by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, most people would describe Reagan and Thatcher as standard conservatives. Neoliberal more accurately describes corporate Democrats like Clinton and Obama, who are moderate in their approach. They represent this concept of rainbow capitalism, where they throw us a bone on social issues, but they still serve the ruling class. Neoliberalism differs from libertarianism because it represents the status quo, not some abstract political theory. Neoliberalism recognizes that some state intervention is necessary to prevent the system from destroying itself, but they strive for as little intervention as possible so as to maximize profits. Also, how exactly is the free market ideal for industries like housing? Shelter is a basic need like food and water. Housing? Really?
Conservatives often accuse neoliberals of being socialists because they accuse everyone of being socialist. Advocating for higher taxation, welfare.
Conservatives are full of shit. Standard liberals like Joe Biden are far from socialist. But leftists are correct in their assessment that neoliberalism, as it is contemporarily defined, is an economically conservative ideology. I wouldn't describe Unnatural Vegan as a conservative. Based on her policy beliefs, she sounds like a social democrat. But SocDems like Kyle Kulinski are much more critical of capitalism. Based on her attitude, she sounds like a typical lib. It's hard to assign a label to her because, as Mexi put it on Twitter, this is the most politically confused load of crap I've ever seen.
But ultimately, the wealth in society that funds that welfare is generated by capitalist mechanisms.
Currently, it is, yes. And why can't we change that?
Same is the case in, what people call European socialism, which isn't really socialism by definition. Still relies on profit motive, still has private ownership, even if a few select industries are publicly owned.
Correct, but you can't claim that Nordic countries are capitalist success stories when they're mixed market economies. The US also has a mixed market economy, but one that is much more capitalistic. When we compare mixed market economies, we see that the ones that are more successful are also the most socialistic. What does that tell us? Before we move on, let's define capitalism and socialism in the most succinct and commonly understood terms. Workplace democracy, aka workers owning the means of production, defines socialism, whereas private ownership and the profit motive define capitalism.
Since socialism is commonly defined as like a transitional state to communism, communism being the goal, I'm going to focus on communism here.
To be honest, I'm not as well versed in political theory as I would like to be, but from my understanding, this is not necessarily the case. Market socialism, aka workplace democracy, is the end goal in my opinion.
So why are neoliberals generally pro-free market and anti-communism? Is the question I want to answer. Philosophy is essential when it comes to ethics, but you can't just think really hard to figure out empirical facts, right? Like when it comes to economics and economic policies and which actually work in practice, which result in a functioning system that promotes a GDP that's conducive to human well-being.
The irony! Bitch, you presented no empirical facts. Your research is sloppy. Who says you can't generate a healthy GDP under socialism? Markets are not exclusive to capitalism. You can still have markets under socialism.
You can think up an ethical system in which it is wrong for one person to ever profit off the work of another person. You can call that exploitation, but in order to put that into practice, you have to just not care about the consequences at all. You would have to ignore all of the times communism has been tried and all of the times it has failed, which is every single time it's been tried, it has failed. It has caused immeasurable suffering and death.
This is just bourgeois propaganda. Ignoring the fact that most socialists denounce authoritarian regimes, and that communist China and the USSR are more accurately described as state capitalist, the death count under capitalism remains much higher. True socialism has not been tried and failed, it has been attempted and sabotaged by global capitalist institutions like the IMF, World Bank, and the US military-industrial complex. This commenter put it well. Basically, anytime a socialist country emerges, the US swoops right in to ruin any chances they might have at succeeding, destabilizes the government and the economy, and then points to them descending into chaos like, see, it just doesn't work. Also, if we're gonna talk empirical facts, generally, whenever socialist policies are implemented, human well-being increases. When policies that prioritize profit, the defining feature of capitalism, are implemented, well-being declines.
I'm a consequentialist. I care about consequences in terms of suffering. Most people care more about having a job, helping their family, than they do about some abstract principle that says it's wrong for their bosses to make a profit off of their labor. And I care more about what people want than I do deciding what people want for them or what I think is better for them based on some sort of cosmic justice.
What? Let me introduce you to the concept of class consciousness. Not everyone is educated and aware of the ways in which they're being exploited. If presented the option, they would probably choose to have a democratic say in decisions that directly affect them.
Injustice in and of itself is not harm. It's only harm when the consequences of injustice actually harm people or sentient beings. And that harm can range from material harm, disease, lead in your water being shot, to immaterial harm like damaged self-esteem.
This makes no goddamn sense. I think she's getting at the idea that wealth inequality is only a problem given that poverty exists. If we were to eliminate poverty, then it wouldn't be an issue that 10% of the population gets to live in extreme luxury. But I still disagree. Let's say you have 2 kids, as I know Swayze does, and you secretly let one of them have more dessert. Week after week, you treat both of your kids, but you give one of them a little something extra. But the other kid doesn't know about it, so technically it's not hurting them. That's still shady as fuck. I'm not saying money should be evenly divided among everyone. There are justified hierarchies. It's fair to pay a highly skilled engineer more money than a secretary, as they produce more value for the company. But the root word in justified is justice.
There may be some level of inevitable harm there when we're talking about capitalism. I'm sure there is. But that only matters if there is an alternative that is better, that if the harm that capitalism causes is worse than some sort of evidence-based alternative. But there is no evidence-based alternative. Or there is one, but the evidence goes in the opposite direction.
There may be some level of harm inherent in capitalism.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
Capitalism is literally destroying the planet. It has brought about the 6th mass extinction. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that there is no clear alternative to capitalism. If we keep chasing after profit, the Earth will become uninhabitable. What choice do we have, lady? A system that requires infinite growth on a finite planet is not sustainable.
Talking about ending capitalism because of the inevitable harms without some solution, without something that actually works better, is like talking about ending food because food on some level is inevitably harmful. True, but maybe dying is worse.
What a bizarre and incoherent analogy. She's comparing food, a broad category, to capitalism, a subset of the category of economic systems, which emerged only a few centuries ago. Sure, we need some sort of economic system for humans to flourish, just as we need healthy food to thrive. Capitalism, in this analogy, is like junk food. It's full of internal contradictions. Here's one. No major industries in the world could be considered profitable from the standpoint of external costs. She's thinking like a carnist. We need meat to build muscle. No, we don't.
Regulated capitalism with a strong safety net is the best system we have based on the systems we actually have evidence on, which is to say probably quite a bit more welfare than we currently have in the US.
Yes, the Nordic model is currently the most successful economic model, but it has major flaws considering it functions off the exploitation of the third world. Why is it so much easier for people to imagine the end of the world than an end to capitalism? Tell me why a fully democratized economy is a bad idea. Provide an actual argument.
It's unreasonable to advocate for hypothetical alternatives when they range from untested to repeated failures. Again, you can't just reason out the ideal economic system for humans or for a particular country without evidence in practice. That's not being rational, it's not being scientifically minded, it's being dogmatic.
We have mountains of evidence that capitalism is destructive and oppressive. We have plenty of evidence that democracy is preferable to oligarchy. We have shining examples of successful worker-owned co-ops. But for her to demand evidence without providing any is bold.
I've talked before about how not all use is abuse. The same goes for exploitation, which refers to unfair use. Some vegans say you can't be vegan unless you are socialist or communist, but there's nothing in the term or the definition that is anti-capitalist. So the argument is something like, veganism means no exploitation, exploitation is capitalism, therefore veganism means no capitalism. Two very big problems with this. First, you have to accept the very specific Marxist definition of exploitation/capitalism, which is essentially begging the question when you define anti-exploitation as requiring Marxism because you've defined capitalism as inherently exploitative. I don't see any reason to accept this definition, the Marxist definition of exploitation. I think it's much better defined as unfair use, and what exactly that means is a lot more complex. Is there sometimes or even often exploitation in capitalistic systems? Of course. There are unambiguous cases, like obvious cases of exploitation, like wage theft and broken contracts. The same with animal agriculture. No choice is given to the animal, obviously, and obviously it's impossible for there to be any sort of fair exchange or any sort of deal made. So yeah, pretty pretty unambiguous exploitation.
Wage theft and broken contracts are blatant examples of exploitation, but so is sweatshop labor. This woman supports sweatshop labor because we're giving people jobs. She argues that boycotting sweatshops will produce bad outcomes because it will leave people worse off, as sweatshops are often the best available jobs in the region. But maybe the problem isn't my refusal to be complicit in these horrendous operations. Maybe the problem is capitalism. Neoliberalism created this situation in the first place. Poor countries aren't poor because of bad internal governance, but rather external forces that led to bad governance. Poor countries are poor because of imperialism, the highest stage of, you guessed it, capitalism. These people are forced to choose between shitty option number 1, shittier option number 2, or starve. How is this a voluntary exchange? And just because the poor in the US fare better than the poor in Bangladesh, doesn't mean they're engaged in voluntary exchange either. Again, if the options are accept this shitty minimum wage job or live on the streets, this is not a free choice. By accepting the shitty job, you are entering into an exploitative relationship. If you have free choice, you are extremely privileged. You are part of the global upper class. Still though, the concept of wage labor is inherently exploitative, as profits are derived from surplus value. In other words, workers are not fully compensated for the value they produce with their labor. This is why there is no such thing as ethical consumption under capitalism. It is a system built on exploitation. If you're paid a living wage and benefits, this is a much less overt form of exploitation. But there are overt and covert forms, just as there are overt and covert forms of racism, sexism, speciesism, etc. Shit's not always obvious, is what I'm trying to say. In a socialist market system, workers are paid dividends rather than wages, representing their part ownership in the company.
There's also a strong case to be made for exploitation in the breakdown of regulatory systems, like monopolies, but that doesn't mean we can't understand how to evaluate fair exchanges. Do we have a long way to go in creating a fairer market via regulation? Certainly. Arguably, we still struggle with monopolies. But that doesn't mean communism is the answer.
Who says communism is the only alternative to capitalism? This is a false dichotomy. Plus, you haven't demonstrated why communism is actually a bad idea.
Which brings me to the second problem. There is no evidence for a practicable alternative. The reason we can say animal agriculture is wrong is because we have well-established alternatives. We know humanity can survive on a plant-based diet. We can grow plants, we can grow only plants, we can feed the world's population, and we can do it without animal products. We just need a shift in the market, one product instead of another. If there were evidence that veganism had the same catastrophic consequences that communism does, like we couldn't grow plants without manure, or we didn't know how to make B12, then we couldn't say animal agriculture is wrong. We couldn't advocate for its abolition because we would have no viable alternative, unless or until like clean meat were a thing. Morality is a product of choice. When it comes to dietary habits and food production, we have a choice and we need to start making the right choice. When it comes to economics, the claim that we have a viable choice in communism just is not true.
Again, demanding evidence without providing any. Worker-owned co-ops exist. Why are they not viable on a mass scale?
None of this means that we shouldn't research economic theory and try to find something better, just like in the hypothetical can't be vegan world. Hopefully we would research how to make B12, how to farm without manure. What it does mean is that it's wrong to advocate for abolishing capitalism based on some hypothetical work and basically a leap of faith.
Again, it's not all based in theory. We also value empirical evidence. But it's true though, we don't have all the answers. I don't have all the answers. We'll have to test run certain policy ideas. If something doesn't work and results in worse outcomes, we can always stop doing it. But if you're worried about causing irreversible damage, you might want to check the time frame for irreversible climate change. At this point, I'd take a leap of faith if it meant that we could possibly prevent climate collapse. A carbon tax and some tweaks around the edges certainly won't. She said in a previous video that she didn't support the Green New Deal. What?
I'm not the vegan police. I don't like to tell people they're not vegan or fake vegan or anything like that. That said, I do think that anti-capitalist sentiment is inherently anti-vegan, at least currently.
This is completely unsubstantiated, as you will see.
If we also mean the human animal, when we talk about animals in the definition of veganism, and, clearly anti-capitalists do, otherwise human economics would be irrelevant, then cruelty to humans is not vegan. Trying to push an entire society into, at best, an unknown situation, putting countless livelihoods and lives at risk within that society based on personal ideological reasons, that's cruel.
Personal ideological reasons? Bitch, shut the fuck up.
The desire to tear down, for no credible reason, any and all capitalistic systems without regard for the human suffering that has always inevitably resulted is cruel.
First of all, this is a bold claim, again, without evidence. There's no reason to believe that socialism will result in more suffering than capitalism. Second, the entire reason we want to shift away from capitalism is because of our high regard for human and animal suffering.
I know the intent is not cruelty, and I'm not saying intent doesn't matter. It does when we're talking about, someone's personal character. But look, when we're talking about animal agriculture, the intent isn't cruelty there either. The intent is to produce a product and to make money. It's the outcome which is harmful and the indifference to the outcome which is cruel. I don't think intent is any excuse in the face of overwhelming evidence of harm, and ideological blindness to that harm is no excuse.
Overwhelming evidence. Bitch, provide it!
And going back to the second part of the definition of veganism, by extension promotes the development and use of animal-free alternatives for the benefit of animals, humans, and the environment. So no part of veganism as a moral choice makes any sense outside of a standard economic model of supply and demand. Without capitalism, eating plant-based is just symbolic. Promoting personal consumer actions and boycotts and alternatives as morally meaningful makes no sense.
Oh boy, there's a lot to unpack here. First, innovation is not exclusive to capitalism. Who says we can't develop animal-free alternatives under market socialism or even communism? Second, veganism is simply putting an anti-speciesist ideology into practice. Anti-speciesist ideology predates capitalism. You think in a democratic society where the workers collectively own the means of production, we wouldn't be able to push for animal liberation? Girl, what universe do you live in? Third, under capitalism, eating plant-based is essentially symbolic due to the government subsidizing the losses of the animal agriculture industries. Because capitalism, in practice, results in corporate socialism. I'm not saying our boycott has no effect on supply and demand, but progressive policy change will bring much more substantial wins for the animals.
The presumption of a capitalistic context, a capitalistic society, is part of the definition of veganism. A denial of capitalism or opting out of capitalism in principle, not only does this make vegan ethics irrelevant, it fails to do good in the most cogent way that veganism acts on the world, by changing production. It's a failure to be vegan in any sense, from ethical principle to consequence. So again, I'm not going to call vegans who happen to be anti-capitalist not vegans, but the ideology of anti-capitalism seems inherently at odds with veganism, at least for now.
God, this woman is insufferably smug. What the fuck are you talking about? You make assertions without arguments. You don't provide any evidence. I'm so over it. Good thing this video is almost over. The capitalist context is only there because we live in a capitalist society. Capitalism is in no way an integral part of anti-speciesism. On the contrary, capitalism is fundamentally incompatible with veganism. Profit-seeking is not conducive to human or animal liberation. Modern factory farms are the product of capitalism. This bitch lives in opposite land.
I don't have any political ideology. I'm not, fervently pro-capitalism. I'm not committed to that. I'm not even committed to neoliberal. It's just kind of the closest descriptor to what I currently believe in terms of politics. I think the only kind of label I fervently defend for myself would be consequentialist, but I am definitely anti-capitalism and communism. There is no evidence for it being anything other than a horrible, dangerous political theory when put into practice.
I don't have a political ideology, but I'm definitely anti-capitalism. I'm not committed to neoliberalism, but let me educate you fools about it. Does she hear the words coming out of her mouth? I think she turns off half her brain when she edits her videos. Let me put it simply. Being anti-something is an ideology. Is anti-speciesism not? And to top it all off, she promos her Amazon affiliate link.
I have an Amazon store page where I have affiliate links to some stuff that I like. I need to probably update that.
Yes, let's all give more money to our tyrannical overlord, Jeff Bezos. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and throw me a tip. Alright, peace out.
Yo, how when me eat them, I wonder when me eat. When me tell them say me no eat no fish, no meat now. How when me eat them, I wonder when me yam. When me tell them say that I'm a vegan man. How when me eat them, I wonder when me eat.